Back in 1970, the middle class earned about 62% of all income in the United States. Today, it's 43%. On top of that, we now spend more of our paychecks just to get by. Many families are one car repair, one hospital visit, or one layoff away from being completely broke. And this is happening in many developed countries too. We can blame greedy billionaires and corrupt politicians, and in some ways, that's totally fair. But what if they too are just symptoms of something deeper? Because even in a world where everyone had good intentions, there would still be something invisible, something intrinsic to our system that chips away at the middle class every single day. But once we understand this force, we can also reverse it. So first, let's imagine a simple market. No greed, no corruption, just people trading goods and services with each other, trying to make the best deal they reasonably can. You'd think that over time, everyone would get richer together, but problems start the moment one person gets just a slightly better deal, even by pure accident. Let's say Mary makes bread and Bob grows apples. They agree on a fair trade, $100 worth of bread for $100 worth of apples. But the scale they use is slightly off. The apples are actually worth $105, so Mary gets an extra $5 in value. And with that extra money, she buys slightly better equipment. Now her bread costs $95 to produce instead of $100. And when she trades again, she earns another $5. So she reinvests again and again, and her advantage grows exponentially. This is something we all intuitively understand. The more money you have, the easier it is to make even more money. In systems science, this kind of runaway cycle is called a reinforcing feedback loop. It happens when an increase in the output of a system produces more input, which then produces even more output. So Mary's initial advantage reinforces itself, and over time, the gap between Mary and Bob gets larger and larger. Even though all either of them did was make the best trade they could, no one tried to make anyone poor. Now, you might say, but in real life, rich people can lose money by making mistakes, and poor people can become rich with the right opportunity. True, that does happen sometimes, but if everyone makes mistakes at roughly the same rate, it evens out in the long run. Plus, the rich can hire better advisors to reduce their chances of mistakes. So, on average, most of the rich still gets richer faster than the poor. And that's exactly what we see historically. Since the 80s, the top 1%'s income has grown more than 7 times faster than the bottom 90%. In fact, the gap grew so fast, even the 1% could not catch up with the 0.1%. Now, you might push back again. Sure, the rich are getting richer, but the poor are getting richer too, just not as quickly. And that can be true if the economy keeps growing forever. Think of it like a pie that never stops expanding. Even if the rich takes a bigger slice, the poor still get a slice that grows over time. But the real world has limits. There are only so many natural resources and so many customers. And those with more money can often outcompete others with better ads and cheaper pricing. Or worse, larger businesses can just buy smaller businesses and shut down their operations later. In other words, once the pie stops growing, the only way for one slice to grow is by taking from another slice. We've seen this play out in just about every industry. In the 1800s, the US oil industry started with dozens of refiners. But by 1900, one company, Standard Oil, took over about 90% of the market. In the mid-1910s, there were over 200 car manufacturers. But by 1930s, the industry was dominated by Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. It's even worse in banking. In 1984, the US had over 14,000 banks. Today, there are fewer than 4,500. And the top 4 now controls about 40% of all banking assets. At this point, you might say, isn't this just greedy CEOs? They could choose not to take over competitors and become monopolies. Yes, individual choices do matter, But there's another force at work here, one that quietly pushes company to grow, even if no one intends to build monopolies. To see this, we need to introduce a secondary market on top of the primary market we've been talking about. In this market, instead of trading existing things, we trade future things. You pay someone now for a promise that they will sell goods and services later, and then pay you back with interest. That's a loan, a bond, a stock. And when those future payments come in, you can buy even more promises, compounding your returns. Now you've created a second reinforcing feedback loop. But this one is a bit different. In the primary market, returns come from selling real goods and services, and that takes time. But in the secondary market, assets can be bought and sold instantly. So when a stock price rises, everyone sees it and piles in. That pushes the price even higher, which attracts even more buyers. And then there's leverage. Investors can borrow money to buy more assets than they can afford. But that debt requires regular payments. So now there's even more pressure to chase higher returns. So the secondary market doesn't just add another loop. It speeds it up and amplifies it. And that pressure flows straight into the real economy. A CEO can be fired even when a company is profitable if it's not growing fast enough. Because investors can easily move money to faster ones. And it's not just rich investors. Over the past few decades, many countries moved away from traditional pensions to stock-based retirement accounts. Today, roughly a third of US stocks are held through retirement systems. That means millions of ordinary people are indirectly dependent on stock price rising. So it's not just greedy CEOs. The entire system rewards growth so strongly that monopolies often emerge naturally. Now, you might say, is that really so bad? Bigger companies also make things cheaper. True, bigger companies can benefit from economies of scale, which can reduce prices. But once a company controls a large share of a market, competition shrinks, and that allows them to raise prices again. We see this in healthcare. Hospitals and insurance companies have merged into larger and larger systems, while healthcare cost per person has grown from about $2,200 in the 1970s to over $15,000 today. Similarly, a USDA study found that highly concentrated grocery markets have food prices 3 to 7% higher than less concentrated ones. Also, when workers have fewer employers to choose from, the whole market starts to push wages down. So the middle class gets squeezed from both sides, higher prices and lower wages, while corporate profits hit record highs. And it doesn't stop there. In recent years, we've built something like a third market. In this one, we don't trade goods or promises of goods. We trade attention. Yes, I'm talking about social media. Social media platforms are designed to be addictive because the longer you stay, the more ads they can serve you. So when a post gets more engagement, the algorithm shows it to more people, and if that gets even more engagement, it gets pushed to even more people. As you've probably guessed, that's another reinforcing feedback loop. But it does more than just amplifying popularity. You see, research shows that sensational and extreme content tends to engage people more than calm, thoughtful content. And such content also drives more political division. So over time, people's actual beliefs drift further and further apart. And just like the middle class, moderate and nuanced views start to disappear too. To be fair, this kind of reinforcing loop didn't start with social media. In the real world, people naturally gravitate towards others who share their beliefs. But social media amplifies this process at a massive scale because the same economic pressure from the first two reinforcing loops pushes these companies to maximize engagement and profit. At this point, it might sound like reinforcing feedback loops are just bad news. But that's not always the case. When businesses reinvest profits into better tools, productivity can rise and goods can become cheaper. When lending and investing gets easier, new projects can secure funding that couldn't before. And social media can help small creators reach millions of people without gatekeepers. The problem isn't markets, profits, growth, or even the reinforcing loops themselves. It's when nothing keeps them in check, when they grow so large that they start to shape us instead of us shaping them. So then how do we keep these reinforcing loops from spiraling out of control? To answer that, let's take a quick detour to Yellowstone National Park, because feedback loops don't just exist in markets, they exist everywhere. For decades, parts of Yellowstone were quietly falling apart. Riverbanks were eroding, wetlands were shrinking, birds, fish, and amphibians were disappearing. At first, this looked like separate problems, but eventually ecologists traced many of them back to a single cause: too many elk. You see, wolves have been hunted out of Yellowstone by the 1920s, and without their main predator, elk populations entered a reinforcing feedback loop. More elk meant more breeding meant even more elk. They overgrazed young trees, especially near rivers, and without those trees to hold the soil in place, the riverbanks and the wetlands disappeared over time. So in 1995, park managers made a controversial decision. They brought the wolves back, and the effects were dramatic. The wolves didn't just reduce the numbers of elk, they also changed elk behavior. Elk stopped lingering along riverbanks. This gave young trees time to grow again. As the trees returned, so did the beavers, and the dams they built created more wetlands. Gradually, birds, fish, and amphibians began to recover. What the wolves created was a balancing feedback loop. Unlike a reinforcing feedback loop, a balancing feedback loop is when an increase in output leads to a decrease in input. When elk multiply, wolves have more food, so wolves multiply too, which then brings elk numbers down. But now, wolves have less to eat, which brings their numbers down too, allowing elk to multiply again. So the two populations keep each other in balance. And that's exactly what our system is missing, a balancing force. But here's the thing, the US actually had that. In 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was created to prevent monopolies. In 1934, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created to curb dangerous speculations in the stock market. Then, in 1949, the Federal Communication Commission enacted the Fairness Doctrine, which ensured balanced coverage in the media. And that's not all. Policies like progressive taxation, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and Social Security were all created during this period. These regulations were not charities. They were necessary balancing loops that stabilized the entire system. As a result, productivity and wages grew nearly at the same rate, and by the 70s, middle-class income had roughly doubled. But then, things started to change. In the 80s and the 90s, top tax rates were slashed, anti-monopoly enforcement were curbed, the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, and financial regulations were gradually rolled back. Not surprisingly, this was exactly when income gaps widened. Corporate consolidation accelerated, media became more polarized, and the cost of living surged. It seems pretty clear-cut. When these balancing regulations were weakened, the middle class shrank. But we have to be careful here. Not all regulations are helpful. Some of them, when poorly designed, can create new problems of their own. The housing market is a perfect example. In the 1930s, the US government standardized the modern mortgage system, allowing millions of families to buy homes with small down payments. This surge in demand would normally push prices up, but at the time, supply also scaled up quickly because land was abundant and construction was fast, making housing affordable for most people. This was a classic case of supply versus demand balancing loop. But over time, new forces entered the system. As cities grew, governments introduced zoning rules, environmental reviews, and building codes. Many of these were well-intentioned. They improved safety, reduced pollution, and prevented overcrowding. But together, they also made housing slower and more expensive to build, especially smaller, affordable homes. At the same time, vacant land near jobs and transit became scarce. And then, after the financial deregulation in the 80s and 90s, housing increasingly became an asset for the investors. So a new reinforcing loop emerged. When home prices rise, investors buy more homes. But new homes can't be built fast enough because of land shortage, zoning limits, and rising construction costs. That limited supply pushes prices even higher, which attracts even more investors. And then existing homeowners often support policies that restrict new construction because rising prices increase their own wealth too. This further limits supply. From 1970 to 2020, median home prices have grown much faster than median household income. It became increasingly harder for people who didn't already own homes to buy homes. So the issue isn't more or less regulations. It's having the right regulations in the right places at the right time. That certainly includes re-strengthening agencies that were designed to prevent concentration of power, like the FTC, SEC, and FCC. But just blocking harmful growth isn't enough. We also need to create healthy growth. That means revamping zoning and permitting systems so more housing can be built faster and at lower costs, while still ensuring safety. Better yet, in places like Vienna and Singapore, a large share of housing is built by the government. So when prices rise too fast, the government can build more homes and bring prices back down. This doesn't have to be purely government-run either. Cities can fund more community land trusts and housing cooperatives. This allows residents to build equity over time while still reducing price speculation. This kind of democratic ownership of essential services isn't new to the US. Large parts of our electricity, water, gas systems have long been publicly and cooperatively run. In many cases, they've delivered stable and affordable services for generations. We just need to apply similar models to other essential industries like housing, transportation, banking, the internet, and maybe even AI in the future. But in order for these balancing loops to work, they have to stay independent. And that means we also need smarter regulations around politics. Because as economic regulations weakened, corporations and wealthy individuals gain more influence over the political system itself. They fund campaigns and shape policies that favor their own growth. This creates a fourth reinforcing feedback loop, one where economic power turns into political power, which then creates even more economic power. And when that reinforcing loop becomes too large, it can override every balancing loop in the system. We often see this during major crises. Like when COVID hit, millions of workers lost their jobs almost overnight. Governments rightfully sent massive stimulus checks to stabilize the economy. But because the reinforcing loops were already so strong, a large share of that money flowed into stocks, real estate, and large corporations. Economists call this a K-shaped recovery. Those who own assets recovered much faster than those who didn't. And this gap has grown so large that today the top 10% earners account for nearly half of all consumer spending. This means a drop in the stock market can reduce a large share of economic activities, causing businesses to cut wages and lay off workers, which can lower stocks even further. This puts pressure on governments to stabilize the stock market, just to reduce the risk of a recession. But again, because our political system favors the rich, that effort will likely widen wealth gap further, making a future recession even more likely. And soon enough, both our economy and democracy will be trapped in a cycle of extreme inequality and collapse. So we need to build a more balanced economic system where wealth actually flows to the working people instead of idling assets. We also need to build a political system that cannot be influenced by money, something that's rooted in real communities. And the US had something like that too. As I mentioned before, the middle class boom from the 1930s to the 1970s was certainly impressive, but it didn't include everyone. Black Americans were systematically excluded from access to mortgages, jobs, and public investment. So they built something else, a network of communities and organizations that eventually grew powerful enough to change the entire system. If you're curious about how this happened, check out my previous video, because there's hidden history and scientific principles behind this movement that rarely get talked about. And if you want to go deeper, this same tension between reinforcing and balancing feedback loops shows up in another video on how to build resilient individuals, organizations, and societies. Lastly, if you'd like to support my work and help my team rely less on ads and sponsors, there is a Patreon link in the description. No pressure. Thank you for being here.